Disney's Pocahontas may have been their first film to be based on historical events, but due to how loose of an adaptation it was compared to what actually happened in history, they received a lot of backlash despite how successful it was. Many people criticize it due to the fact that they see the movie as a romanticized depiction of when the New World was colonized, which in reality was a travesty, and it essentially destroyed the Native American population. One thing that Disney sort of got correct though was their protagonist, Pocahontas. She was actually based on a living person from the time period, and the history behind the person she was based on is actually really interesting. Though, as we said, Disney took many liberties when making the movie, causing quite a few myths and common misconceptions to be formed around who the real-life Pocahontas was and what actually happened to her. 5 of them in particular have caught our eye, and when you learn the true history behind them, we think you might be surprised. In the Disney film Pocahontas, we all remember the scene where the tribes gather and decide to put an end to their prisoner, John Smith's life. They drag him out during a ceremony and prepare to club him to death. However, lucky for John, the chief's daughter Pocahontas had fallen madly in love with him and threw herself on him and told her father to stop. She wanted peace, not war. This idea actually came from something that the real John Smith said after being freed. John Smith claimed that his life was about to come to an end, but the daughter of the chief thankfully saved his life. And since saying that was a story that was told time and time again. It ultimately became the main plot point of the legend behind Pocahontas. Now, a few people, mostly romantics, will still defend the claims that John made centuries ago, but it turns out that most historians won't give the idea a second thought. In their eyes, those chain of events would never happen. According to historians, in the Algonquian culture, they would have never murdered a prisoner of war by clubbing them to death. That just wasn't what they did. Their tribe, had the chief chosen to kill John, would have either tortured him to death or burned him alive. And apparently, even if they had chosen to club John to death in a big ceremony, there's absolutely no way that the chief would have stopped just because his daughter wanted him to. He would not have let himself be seen as weak in front of his tribe for letting a man go because his daughter loved him. Now, this isn't to say that John wasn't dragged out into a ceremony that he had no idea what was going on. In fact, most historians have come to believe that John was involved in a ceremony where their tribe may have been considering making him their sub-chief, while still maintaining their authority over him. Hence why John thought it was so threatening. As for being saved by a woman, that was simply a tale that Smith was known for telling apparently. It looks like not everyone fell for the tales that John would spin. In fact, some of the first settlers in Jamestown were some of the more vocal ones to call John out, with the very first president of Jamestown going as far as to call him a liar, and another leader of Jamestown being known to describe John as vainglorious, meaning that he was too prideful or proud of his achievement. He had an ego like no other, and it looks like some people took note of it. Some people even made satirical poems mocking his writings. Sadly, not everyone was so keen, and with his ego came charisma. Some people enjoyed listening to his tales of triumph and achievements, many of which were early Americans, often treating John as if he were some sort of hero. This was at least until around the Civil War. It was at that point that a lot of Northern authors began to make claims about his credibility and the fact that he was lacking any. Some Southern authors saw this as an attack and began to defend John and his writings to no end. According to William Rasmussen, the lead curator of the Virginia Historical Society, she, Pocahontas, was very much a pawn in the argument between the North and the South, leading up to the Civil War. And with Pocahontas being used as a pawn, so were John Smith's writings. But nowadays, it would seem that a lot of historians and nonfiction authors understand that a lot of the tales that John Smith told and wrote about were often contradicted by tales passed down among Native Americans for the past 400 years. Sadly, back then people didn't have access to information as we do now, and a lot of stories and history were just word of mouth and a lot of storytelling. Another one of the biggest misconstrued facts that a ton of people took away from the movie was the fact that Pocahontas was in love with John Smith and vice versa. It wasn't just Disney though. The same concept was depicted by tons of authors throughout the early 1800s and so on. Most of them would have their audience believe that the two had a love that was indeed fit for a Disney film, but there's actually no historical evidence that would support that claim. And in all honesty, most people wouldn't be too happy if it were true, considering the age difference between the two. You see, it would have been quite disturbing if Pocahontas and John had fallen for each other during the times that she was making her visits to the recently settled Jamestown. At that time, around 1608, Pocahontas would have only been about 12 years old. Meanwhile, John, the person that many people would have the world believe was in love with her, was an adult at the age of 28. Now, some people believe that because of a statement that John made almost a decade later that the two had to have been in love, but that likely was not the case. So, John left Jamestown about a year after Pocahontas' repeated visits. It wasn't until 8 years later, in 1616, that he and Pocahontas would reunite in England while Pocahontas was visiting visiting for a lengthy stay of about a year. John Smith made a claim that she was so excited to see him that she could barely speak. She had just been so overcome with emotion. However, according to historians, she was very vocal during her stay there and often accused the English of lying. As far as history tells us, it is safe to assume that the pair developed some sort of friendship or rapport, but to say that they were romantically involved was just something made up by what historians refer to as Romantic era writers. And since then, the idea has just grown to the point where most people will hear that version of events before they are aware of the actual history behind it. According to most accounts of what happened in Jamestown, most of the English enjoyed it when Pocahontas would stop by. Her visits would often bring with them food as a gift from her father, the chief, which was a big deal because at the time, a lot of the settlers were less than full on food. Famine was a big issue, and Pocahontas helping them fight it off little bits at a time. Now, though they enjoyed her presence, it has been said that the settlers never intended to maintain peace between them and the tribes. They never even thanked Pocahontas for her gifts of food. Instead, they would often thank God. The settlers also never really cared about Pocahontas as a person. She was just a means to survive. Apparently, once war broke out between the tribes and the settlers in 1609, Pocahontas would no longer visit the tribes, and her presence in history essentially disappeared, up until a few years later when she was kidnapped in 1613. We learned that in 1613 she was kidnapped by Captain Samuel Argall from England, and he held her hostage for years. She only gained her freedom after she agreed to convert to Christianity and marry a Christian by the name of John Rolfe. Their marriage brought about a sort of peace between the tribes and the settlers. Now, that was the English side of history. According to Virginia's Native Americans, she was actually already married amongst her tribe to a warrior. That warrior was named Kocoum, and he married Pocahontas before she had been kidnapped by Captain Argall. The stories told by the Native Americans even mention that the settlers not only killed Kocoum when they took Pocahontas, but while she was their captive, they also assaulted her. Even when she went on her voyage to England in 1616, it was said that she was viewed more as an object than a human being, and she was often stared at in fascination. Many attribute this voyage to her death, seeing how she fell ill just after starting her voyage back home. She passed away in March of 1617. Many believe she died from disease, though her sister and brother-in-law who were with her overseas believe she had been poisoned somewhere down the line. And finally, our last fact has us looking at her name, Pocahontas. A lot of fans of the story have come to believe that Pocahontas was the actual name of the woman that the movie was based on, when in actuality, that was simply her nickname. You see, something that we found super interesting was that the name Pocahontas was the way that the Algonquin-speaking tribes often referred to their young. It was a nickname meaning the same thing as Little Mischief. It would be the equivalent of calling a kid Little Rascal today. So what that means is that it wasn't a name or title that she would have kept for her entire life. Pocahontas was born around the year of 1596, and as far as we know, she was the child of Wahunsenach, who was better known to the English as Powhatan. Powhatan was the chief of a large group that included somewhere around 30 different tribes. Back in the day, and even now sometimes, Native Americans would receive multiple different names. Two of the more known ones for the woman that Pocahontas was based on were Amanute and Matoaka. What is even more interesting is after the events that we saw loosely depicted in the film, in 1614 she married John Rolfe, at which time she gained another Christian name, which was Lady Rebecca. It was only because John Smith referred to her as Pocahontas in his writings that she became famously known by that name. His stories of her propelled them both to fame, whether Amonute wanted it or not, and it forever branded her as Pocahontas. It's always good to tell the side of the story that is not always passed down or heard. Sometimes we aren't even aware that there was or could be another side to what the majority assume to be fact. Awareness and listening are always key in getting the truth, and it's always important to make sure we are listening. Pocahontas was a movie that, to this day, is still loved by most people who have seen it, but it's equally as interesting to learn the facts behind what actually happened in history. We're curious to know though, did any of you guys know any of these facts already? And if you did, which ones? Let us know in the comment section down below. As for now, that's all Disney fans. Let us know what video you'd like to see next in the comments, and like and subscribe for more magically packed videos.